Okay, so yeah, thanks for coming to check out this talk. I'm Darren, and I am an activist, and I volunteer with DXE, and I do some animal liberation organizing in Vancouver. For the past year and a half, I've been working as a research assistant with the University of British Columbia's Animal Welfare Program. And so this talk is mostly about a project that I wanted to do. So some parts of it might come across as kind of like a bit more academic and less to do with animal advocacy and animal liberation. But I think in the end, like for the discussion we'll have at the end, I kind of want to like reframe everything like you see here in a more animal liberation perspective, so we can have those conversations and talk about like what are the implications of the things we discuss here. But before I actually go into my talk, I just want to show this video first. So this is what happens when a rat got onto like a subway train in New York City. And this went a bit viral like not too long ago, so you might have seen it already. Yeah, so this is what happens to like rats, how humans kind of perceive rats outside of the labs. And obviously there's like a lot of fear and aversion and sort of discrimination against rats, and just people tend to see them as pests and vermins. But so this is outside of the labs. This is what happens to rats inside the labs. And this is actually not a photo, like you're watching a video here. And so obviously these animals are confined in a tiny space. They're barely moving around. There's really not much for them to do, and they're just kind of immobile most of the time. Okay, so and this is just kind of to give you more context. Like usually these small cages are stacked up, and this is how they're housed in a laboratory environment. There might be bright lights, loud noises. It's not like a friendly environment for the animals, for the rats. Yeah, so as I said, outside the labs, the problems are human aversion, fear, discrimination. In the labs, they suffer from suppressed motivated behaviors, boredom, helplessness, anxiety, lack of stimulation, depression. And because of like a combination of factors, a lot of rats are used in scientific research. So about 300,000 per year from in the last kind of decade in Canada, and then 300,000 in the UK. So I know in the US, apparently the number of rodents used like this, there are no statistics, like people just don't track that, and that's how little respect I guess like people have for rats, or it could be also be seen as a deliberate action to like just not track their numbers because they don't even count as animals. So given that context, given that situation, so two researchers at the Animal Welfare Program at UBC decided to do some animal welfare research to assist the rats and improve their lives in the laboratory. And so so both of them are like my friends, like I know them personally. And Joy Satorino was a visiting scholar at UBC, and she was only there for not very long, I think about a year, and Joanna Mikowska is still there right now, finishing her PhD. And I think their more radical goal is actually to use science to convince other scientists to stop using animals, or to stop using rats in research, like in general. But so far, like whenever they go to conferences and like talk about their projects, it's always been framed as like how to make like the environment, living environment for rats better in the laboratory, and in a very kind of welfareist framework. But anyways, so how they decided to assist the rats, they actually went into the labs and they created space for them. And how they've done this was just by bringing these kind of massive cages that you might have if you have rats as companion animals at home. And these big cages, so this is one of Joanna's cages, and she's got 6 of them. And there are a lot of objects for the rats to interact with. This like hammocks, climbing structures, tubes for them to hide in. And she's actually added a layer of soil at the bottom, and the rats can actually like burrow and dig tunnels in the soil. So she considered this she calls it a semi-naturalistic environment, or an enriched cage. So I'll use those terms maybe interchangeably when I'm like going through this talk. But the idea is that because the rats can perform so many more of their natural behaviors that they're actually motivated to perform, and that's why the environment is semi-naturalistic. And Joyce, yeah, she's got like a similar cage, but she doesn't have soil, and instead she uses fleece, which you might see later, like it's a similar kind of effect on the rats. And the fleece is like a material that rats apparently tend to enjoy in general. So here are the differences. So these are both videos, and they're both fast forwarded at like 4 times the speed, and they're both taken around the same time during the day where you would find the rats to be most active. And you can just see the differences between a small cage in the bottom right and an enriched cage. Yeah, so once again, like that's not a photo, that's actually a video that's running, and you can see like the rats aren't really moving. So in the enriched cages, like the rats can perform a lot of behaviors, like they can climb around. Here's a video of a rat climbing. And this is one of Joanna's rats. This is one of Joyce's rats. Just kind of climbing around. It's really cute. They also like to perch. This is something they enjoy, which is sitting on like a higher elevation. And they can perform this behavior called full rearing, which is basically when they stand up straight and they can like fully extend their backs. And this is just like comparison between, so this is like rearing in the standard cage versus like in a much more open space. And you can see in the standard cage, the rats aren't even able to stand up straight. And obviously, like with bigger space, they can actually run around, and they do this thing called bounding, which is when all 4 of their paws come off the ground at once. So in the video, just kind of keep your eye on the bottom left-hand rat there. That is slow motion.
Action shot.
It is similar. Because rats move so fast, you have to like watch it in slow-mo to actually see a lot of the things they do. And with objects, so they really love, sleeping as a group in the hammocks. It's something they really enjoy. Or an IKEA plastic bag dispenser apparently works really well. They can climb on it and they kind of use it as a hammock. Yeah. And with the soil, they like to burrow. And apparently, when Joanna went to conferences and gave talks, basically showing these images, a lot of people working in the labs were really shocked when they saw this, because there's this general assumption that a lot of natural behaviors for rats were kind of selectively bred out of them after generations of breeding. So they didn't even think that rats can like burrow in the soil, and so seeing rats burrow had like a huge impact on them, and they didn't know. It's just kind of, it completely changed their perspective on how they view these animals. And this is, yeah, the rat burrowing. It's really cute. They shovel a bunch of dirt to their belly and then they kind of like kick it out. And so this is like what they do with the fleece. They like to hide under the fleece. And if you look at the top left-hand corner, like it appears like they're doing something similar to burrowing, even when they're like is in the soil. But if they can like hide under something, they kind of want to do that. And they also enjoy interacting with objects. If you just give them things to make it tougher for them to get food, it's actually stimulating for them. So there's this concept that, I can't remember which psychologist who studied animal behavior, he coined it, he calls it contra freeloading. So the idea is that for almost all animals, or like most animals, if given the opportunity to choose between just receiving something for free or actually working for something, they almost always prefer to work for something, which is much more rewarding and stimulating. And here are the rats trying to get like treat cereals out of the treat ball, where they have to roll it around and like kind of get it out. I think these guys were kind of slightly more aggressive. They're going to fight for it. Right, so there are huge differences in the different environments that the rats live in just in terms of the number of things they can do, and also just like the way that people perceive them differently. And yeah, so I think, so I wanted to use basically like social political theory to kind of analyze and interpret the work and reframe the work that my colleagues have done with their experiments with rats. And one of the concepts I came across was called trust-based dependent agency, and this was something that Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicka talked about in their book Zoopolis, which I highly recommend that everyone read and check out. It's a really good book. And they say that this is a type of agency that is exercised in and through relations with particular others with whom the rats, I guess in this case, the rats trust, and who have the skills and knowledge needed to recognize and assist the expression of that agency. And in order to participate in this kind of, in the trust-based dependent agency, the animals involved in this interaction need to have the capacity to express their subjective good as revealed through various forms of behavior and communication, which we basically just saw that the rats perform behaviors to communicate to us like what they're actually motivated to do. And they also have the capacity to comply with social norms through their evolution of trusting relationships. And this we'll see later, we'll talk about this more later when we discuss socialization of animals. And they also need to have the capacity to participate in shaping terms of interaction. So they have a say in how they want to interact with you. It's not just you're always making them demands. And so, but I want to go beyond that and say that the agency is actually interdependent. It's not just like the non-human animals are dependent on humans in order to express their agency, but in a political situation where we're actually doing animal advocacy, for example, our agency is just as much dependent on their agency. And so going back, so this is kind of how I view the relationship between Joanna and Joyce with their rats, but how they actually allow this agency to be exercised. And by, I guess I should explain, by agency it just means like, agency just means you have control in the world, like you're able to perform actions that actually impact your environment and impact the relationships you have with other beings in the world. And how they've done this was they created what, I guess, I don't know how to describe Bruno Latour. He's like a philosopher of science, but he's also like a sociologist. He's like many different things. And he came up with this concept called speech prosthesis, which he describes it as something that scientists, or what he calls lab coats, have invented that allow non-humans to participate in the discussions of humans when humans become perplexed about the participation of new entities in our collective life. And that sounds kind of like hard to understand. And by lab coats, he doesn't just mean scientists in the traditional sense that we understand them to be. So traditionally, we kind of just view scientists as these experts and they kind of know best. But lab coats, it's kind of more like how we might describe people as blue collar or white collar, or sometimes we call like business people or lawyers like suits, you know? It's got a more historical and like social political connotation to it. So lab coats are like scientists but politicized, and they are political figures in what they do. They're not just these like objective experts who are like always rational and like detached from all the political stuff in the world. But anyway, so this is kind of confusing, but political theorist Lisa Dish made a distinction that might help us understand it better. So speech prosthesis could be understood, I think, as an experimental apparatus. So she says, traditionally we kind of view the way that scientists do science is like there are these facts that speak for themselves once the experiment is done, and the role of the scientist is just to transmit those facts. But a more accurate way to look at this, I wouldn't say, maybe it's not more accurate, but a more interesting way, a different perspective on this, is that scientists who actually work in a laboratory and they design an experimental apparatus to stage a phenomenon, so they allow a phenomenon to happen, and then this phenomenon then acts as a reliable witness that authorizes the scientist to speak in its name. So in this case, the phenomenon itself has agency. It's not just like that the scientists are transmitting the facts or like interpreting the data, but the data itself has agency that authorizes the scientists to represent it. And I think this is kind of an interesting way to think about working with animals within a scientific institution, is that the animals are not just data, like they have agency, and even within an experimental apparatus, so the cages, they perform certain behaviors and emotions that allow the scientists who are looking at them to then represent them maybe politically. And I think by doing both of those things, by using a speech prosthesis and building that trust-based dependent or interdependent agency, is a form of solidarity building. And here I distinguish between internal and external solidarity. So internal as in sort of you're either going into an oppressive space or an oppressive institution, or you're working within them to make changes. And so for Joyce and Joanna, they literally they went into a laboratory, which is like a very oppressive space for non-human animals because they're being exploited in the space, and so they've created space for them to allow them to express their agency. And I also want to make a distinction between solidarity and savior complex. So Joyce and Joanna didn't go into the labs thinking they're going to save any specific rats. It's not really like a rescue situation where you actually go in and you save these animals from an awful end to their lives. But solidarity as in mutual aid, so they're actually assisting each other to achieve a political objective. So you might critique what internal solidarity. You might ask why is that even necessary when there might be other forms of solidarity that are that does not require working within an oppressive space, because every time you work within an oppressive institution, you might be legitimizing it even more. So kind of like the welfarist approach, when you just keep changing the size of confinement, cages, for example, it doesn't really change the relationships between the animals who are in the space. And so a good example of a different type of solidarity would be an external one, where you either take animals out of the oppressive space, such as in the case of a rescue, or you kind of study them outside of an oppressive space in their natural environment. So Manuel Berdoy is animal behavior psychologist, behaviorist in Oxford, and back in 2002 he did this thing where he took, I think, about 50 rats who were born and bred in the laboratory, and he just took them out into this controlled wild environment to see how well they would adapt to that environment and how well they survive compared to just wild rats. And it turned out most of them did extremely well. They just adapted quickly. They performed all the necessary behaviors to survive and reproduce their population. And it's so it's very different. And more examples of external solidarity. farm sanctuaries, for example, you know, you rescue animals from oppressive spaces such as factory farms or not just farms in general. And yeah, so they perform different behaviors that they otherwise wouldn't be able to do, or field work like done by scientists like Chang or Barbara Smuts, where they just go into the forest and they just observe the primates and bring back the stories about primates and images and videos to the humans and influencing human perceptions of these animals that way, without having to capture these animals and then studying them in the lab in order to produce a knowledge about them. But I think internal solidarity is still important because we have to consider what I call a social natural position. Oh, that's a typo. It should be positionality or position. But basically the social natural position of these animals. And all animals experience the world differently. We all live in this world and we experience it differently. And here I want to consider the concept of fitness. And here it's just this is a bit of mental masturbation for me, a little bit. It's just I find this concept of fitness interesting in different ways, kind of informative in the way we think about our relationship with animals. So fitness in the evolutionary sense is good for rats as a species because they are really fit, they reproduce really quickly and in high numbers. So as a species, they're actually doing very well. But it's also kind of unfortunate to think about fitness in the individual sense. So in the literal sense of the word for individual rats, and that rats are their physical size is really small, so they literally fit into spaces really well. So they're very manageable. You can capture them, you can confine them in high numbers and keep them in these cages. So their small, docile bodies are easy to train, control, and manage. And because of this fact, there's almost a near total control of the lives of rats in the laboratory environment. So humans, scientists and corporations who produce these rats for scientific experimentation, they have a lot of control over the lives of the rats. And in the wild environment, I guess rats also suffer from just being a prey species. So they're very vulnerable and they have many predators. So taking all this into account, I think internal solidarity is important because we sometimes have to think about fighting the battle at the site of the struggle, which would be inside the labs. So to give you an example of how I come to realize how difficult it is to actually advocate for rats and help them with their struggles. So I worked in a laboratory, so I basically worked for my friend Joanna, who's working her PhD, and all I did was I take care of the rats, I give them treats, I clean their cages. But inside the lab, there's this is the door of the euthanasia room, and on it is information. It's a brochure about Orphaned Wild Rehabilitation Society, where it's basically a rehabilitation shelter for wild animals, mostly big birds. And it turns out that a lot of rodents who are eligible so they don't have weird chemicals in their bodies, if they're eligible to become food for these animals, they're often just sent off after they've been euthanized. They'll be sent off to these shelters. And so this is kind of a very strange way in which people inside the labs, they understand the position of the rats in the natural world, and they kind of use it, they exploit that to naturalize a practice that is basically exploitation and violence against animals. So given their social natural position, I think lab rats experience oppressive spaces differently from other species and may require different forms of solidarity. So for example, with primates, we would never think that we should do what's been done with these rats, right? We wouldn't say we want to capture them, bring them back into the lab, and then show their behaviors, and then convince scientists about how complex primates are in order to argue for an end of using primates in scientific experimentation. But because all the knowledge we have of primates from field work done by people like Jane Goodall, I think it should be sufficient that we don't have to do something like that. But with rats, it's kind of a tougher scenario just because they're so easy to control. So when Joyce did her work with rats, she actually practiced socialization, which is something that Joanna didn't do with the rats. And this is really significant, which I will talk more about in a bit. But she practiced what she describes as positive interaction, and which I consider a form of internal solidarity. And basically it's just socialization. So she interacted with the rats for 1 hour per day as she would interact with her pet rats. And it's usually through gentle and playful handling, food treats, caring and holding them. And she also allows the rats to explore. So her rats come out of the cages and even like kind of just crawl around on the floor of the room. And this is Joyce handling some of her rats and kind of socializing with them and bonding with them. And that sound, that high-pitched sound you're hearing, like usually you won't be able to hear that. They use like a special recording device to capture, and that sound that the rats are making is actually like a pleasurable kind of noise. They're signaling like they're actually happy. And this is Joyce and one of her rats doing a behavioral like experiment training session where she's training her rats to go into this plastic thing where they're gonna test. I can't remember what they were testing. I think it was like a fairness equity experiment. I don't know if you guys have like heard of those or seen those, which is basically seeing if different animals received different quality of treats, for example, if they would find it unfair, like if we get mad at like the animal that's getting a better treat, or get mad at the people who's like handing out the treat, which is like an interesting phenomenon if you're like interested in animal cognition and cognitive capacities. But basically you saw, because of socialization, there's really like the rats was very willing to participate in something like this. And I want to mention that the rats have never been deprived of food and water, so they're actually doing this on like just out of their own will, and so arguably they actually find this kind of interaction very rewarding in themselves. But this is problematic because you can see how once you gain the trust of the animal, you can get them to do stuff. So maybe this makes the animals easier to exploit, and especially when put into the context of using animals for research, like positive interaction maybe isn't like the best thing to do with these animals. And Joanna's animals actually have never been socialized with humans, so they're actually very fearful and they will bite you if you actually try to hold them. So that's something that just I'm still thinking through, because like what's actually better? Do you want the animals to have remain the capacity to be aggressive so they can kind of like defend and fight for themselves, or do you want this trustful relationship where the animals trust you, but in the long term that might be beneficial for them, because I think it's a really tough act to break a trust with an animal, and if more lab workers all had this type of interaction with the rats, maybe over time they'll be like, no, I can't do this anymore, and like as a society we might all become more compassionate with rats. At least that's what my friend Joyce would argue, and that's why she believes in doing something like this. And I don't know, I find it kind of problematic. Like I'm still trying to decide who knows what's best. And through socialization with humans, rats actually become a lot of less aversive to humans. So you saw it like in the first video. I find this kind of funny, like that first video in the New York subway station, right? How everybody was just freaking out with this one rat running around. For rats, if they're familiar with humans, they'll just come right up to strangers. So this is Joanna meeting Joyce's rats for like one of the very first times where they're still not very familiar with each other, and the rats are just very willing to just climb onto them and explore and find out more about this person. And this was like one of my first times meeting Joyce's rats, where like I didn't really know them very well, but they just climbing around on my shoulder. And another, I guess, potential benefit of socialization is that rats can actually be adopted out because they've conformed to like the social norm that humans have determined, where they won't bite people, so they can continue to live their lives outside of the lab. So the good, good ending to the story about Joyce's rats is that all of them were actually adopted out. So this was Joyce's mom visiting the rats when she came to Vancouver, and yeah, so this is also something that I kind of think about, like the difference between the different statuses that animals can gain by being socialized. So there's a huge difference between being adoptable and being disposable. But I don't, as I mentioned earlier, I don't think internal solidarity on its own is enough, because it's that process of internal solidarity is can be very easily hijacked by people who want to exploit animals and do terrible things to them. So I argue like there's this extra step we have to take, which is to externalize internal solidarity. And this part is more just like me talking about my own project. And it's basically, I've decided the way to do this is through a survey. And I wanted to do a survey where basically the participants of the survey will view a presentation, the exact presentation that you just saw with the rats kind of doing their thing inside the cages, and compare it to like the rats in the standard cages who are just immobile and barely doing anything. And after viewing the presentation, I asked them, are you inclined to advocate for better housing systems that allow rats to express natural behaviors they're motivated to perform? And I came up with that question, which is like very welfareist, because at the time I was kind of still working with a welfare group, so I thought to get like a buy-in for their approval of this survey, I should kind of frame it within a welfareist framework. But I think if I do carry out this survey, I might just add an extra question, which is something that animal liberationists might ask, like, are you inclined to advocate for ending the use of rats in scientific research? I might even frame it differently, like, are you willing to take political actions or like speak out for these rats for stopping violence against them? And if they answer yes, I want to know like what ways they can actually help the rats to achieve whatever the goal is. And if no and neutral, then like I ask them to elaborate. And I think that part is really important too, because in building solidarity and building like alliance with anyone, like it's not just about you saying you want to help them, but it's important to say like what you're actually willing to do to help them. And then I just want to ask a couple more questions to kind of get people's attitude of rats. And I asked them, like, pretend for a moment that so one of them is specific rats you saw in the presentation. Pretend if they can fully understand human language. If there's one thing you could say to them, what would you say? And the other one is pretend for a moment that all lab rats can fully understand human language. What would you say to them? And I think that's important because like we talk to animals all the time, like non-human animals who we live with or might visit somewhere else, like at a farm sanctuary. And I think it's really in speaking to these animals that our language reveals a lot of our attitudes about them. So so I think that's important as well in thinking about like what type of relationships humans actually want to have with non-human animals. And so the purpose of externalizing internal solidarity through a survey like that is to first identify who are the rats' self-identified human allies, understanding their attitudes toward the rats. And I'm just gonna let the train pass. And just find out what they would actually be willing to do for the rats as rats' allies. So this allows humans external to the labs an opportunity to try and come up with creative forms of interdependent agency and rat advocacy where humans and rats empower each other. So within the labs, the interdependent agency, that interaction between Joyce and Joanna and their rats, is just between them. So it's interdependent because the rats would not have been able to perform those behaviors in the bigger cages if the humans didn't create that space for them. But then like the humans wouldn't have been able to go to the conferences and like speak out on behalf of these rats if the rats didn't do those behaviors, right? So it's like very much their agencies are bound up in each other's agencies. and in that way they empower each other. So we can externalize that and think about like how we can like empower rats and how rats can empower us as activists, as people who are not working inside the laboratory. Like whether, you know, maybe we'll use videos, maybe we'll actually bring rats out to demonstrations, maybe we'll use, you know, photos that represent a certain aspect of rats that we're trying to communicate to other human beings. So I guess the hope of this project is that in the long run, attitudes towards rats in general will, you know, take the form of greater care and respect, and political relationships can be built between humans and lab rats for more effective animal advocacy. And that's the whole presentation. So, general discussions, questions, and,
So I just had a historical question about how you ended up working in the lab and what sort of research Joanne and what was the other woman's name?
it was Joanna and Joyce.
Joanna and Joyce. So the research, Joyce is doing psychological research, I guess, or sort of ethological research about animal behavior.
Yeah.
What is the research Joanna is doing, and how do they even get involved in kind of animal research as people who obviously have a pretty strong emotional connection to these rats?
Yeah, so Joyce's story is actually very interesting. She used to be a neuroscience student and researcher, and so how she ended up like basically falling in love with rats is that the lab that she was working at, like the principal investigator, so like whoever was in charge, actually gave the research assistants like rats to take home to interact with them and get used to handling them. And so she was originally going to participate in a project that's going to be like exploitative of these rats, but through that interaction, like taking the rats home and like playing with them, she decided like, whoa, like this is really messed up. And since then she's been sort of advocating for rats through science, I guess, by studying, through ethology, studying their behaviors and even their cognitive capacities, like studying their psychologies, which is why she was doing that like fairness and equity research.
That's not a very common practice, right? Asking your research assistants or graduate students to take rats home. I've never heard of it. My dad.
Yeah, I think that's actually very rare. I'm not sure why that lab decided to do that. Most lab workers are so inadequately trained. They basically read the manual and they might interact with the animals like once and then they're ready, like apparently to handle these rats in the labs. Joanna, I can't quite remember, but she was like an animal biology student, and that's what she did for like her undergraduate degree and master's degree, and I assume like just, you know, her love for animals kind of led her to pursue her project. Yeah. And did you want to ask like how I got involved?
Yeah, how
as
did
well?
you get involved in this, and how long ago was it, and were you an animal liberationist at the time?
Yeah, so it's all really kind of bizarre thinking back like how things happened, but when I was doing, I think it was in my fourth year of my undergraduate degree, I was taking this course called Political Theory and Non-Human Life, where it was like a seminar where students like read, you know, like political theory texts from the past and then like use that to think about the impact that our historical ideas have on non-human animals and non-human life in general. And during the time I was taking that course, the group Stop UBC Animal Research was like very active and basically targeting UBC and trying to get them to be more transparent and accountable for their animal research. And so we thought like as a class of like students who are doing this, studying this topic, we have some sort of responsibility as students and as the professor to organize something on campus to bring this issue up for discussion, like among different disciplines. So yeah, our professor and a group of us ended up organizing a series of like discussion panels, and through organizing that, I came into contact with the animal welfare program and met people there, and it seemed like they were really interested in doing more social science work. So the animal welfare program does predominantly scientific research with animals, and most of their funding comes from the dairy industry actually. So they do experiments to improve the lives of dairy cows, but they've shown interest in because they understand, I guess, that science is not what changes. Science alone cannot change public attitudes towards animals. So they've been doing these surveys where they ask people contentious questions about contentious practices and issues with animal welfare. And that's where I got an opportunity to work with them on survey work, basically.
So the animal welfare program is kind of expressly oriented toward trying to improve the lives of animals.
Yeah, they have like a mission statement on their website where they actually said like we're not an advocacy group, like we don't do advocacy, we just do research, and you know, we produce the facts about animals, and hopefully this will change industry practices and things like that. Yeah.
How is your relationship with other kind of animal research on site? I assume there's some sort of firewall between the research they're doing and the research that's being done by, like, you know, the biology program or, you know, the organic chemistry program, or is there? You see what I'm saying?
So like, what's the animal welfare program's relationship with like other scientific?
Sure, other animal testing facilities on campus.
They try to maintain good relationship with them just so they can continue to have these conversations, and that's it. Like that's kind of they try not to. They'll suggest things to other researchers if they happen to believe something is a better practice. They'll recommend it to different people who maybe like work with animals or serve on the animal care committees, or they also have really good relationships with university veterinarians who look after these animals, and they want that because they want to have influence and impact on people who are around these animals regularly on campus. And yeah, maybe that's why it's not like, I find the type of project I want to do, it doesn't quite fit well with what I want to do because it's too politically charged.
Sure.
And it pisses off too many people, and that just cuts off conversations. Yeah. I don't know, questions? Yeah.
I'm just curious about the research that was, I think, done in 2002 by the Oxford scientists taking lab rats and putting them in a pseudo-natural space. I'm curious, were these lab rats simply born and then put in the natural environment, or were they born, lived in a lab environment for a while, a few months, a year, whatever, and then put in a natural environment?
I don't know the details, but yeah, like my understanding is that prior to being released into the wild, they have never experienced anything like that. And
Well, yeah, certainly.
right, yeah, so they're born inside the labs.
Yeah. I'm just curious, like, how accustomed they were, perhaps, to like lab conditions.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that I wouldn't know,
Okay.
but if you consider, I think by the time they were released, they seemed to be adult rats at that point.
Okay.
So that would mean they probably lived for quite a while in the labs.
Oh, okay.
Before
Interesting.
heading out.
Okay.
Yeah. And the website is called ratlife.org if you want to check out, like there's like an entire documentary that Menno Bernoulli did on his research with those rats, and it's really interesting. And it's all free to watch.
Okay.
Yeah.
Ratlife.org. I'll write this down.
I think on the website it's in weird little downloadable chunks, but if you go to YouTube, the whole thing.
Yeah, it's on YouTube too,
Yeah.
that's right. Yeah, maybe we can even watch it later. It's really interesting.
So I guess I had more of a comment to just bring up, and I talked about this during the forum, and I think we talked about this. But I like how you make this distinction between solidarity and between the savior complex, because I think it's very common within the animal rights movement to kind of take on the savior role, like that these individuals are kind of they don't have agency, and that we're there to just come in and help them. And that's something that, like, you know, is going to boost our self-image and how we feel about ourselves, like as just good people doing this. But I think it's important that you reframed it in a way of showing that this is kind of, you know, a relationship that is based on, like, with an equal, to emphasize that they do have agency, and then that does also bring in, I think, more kind of respect for them in a way, you know. But I just was curious about, like, maybe you can elaborate on that a little more.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I think like you hear it a lot in animal rights, animal liberation movement, how people talk about like speaking for, it's like we act as a voice for the voiceless, right? Like these animals don't have a voice, and that's why it's important for us to speak out on their behalf. But I think those like theoretical concepts I introduced earlier about like a speech prosthesis and how like animals can communicate with humans through you know, basically body language, that, you know, it's, you know, I think they do have voice, but their voice has been like silenced and suppressed, or humans are just not willing to listen to them.
Unable, like the ultrasound meter, right?
Right. Or listening
Super cool,
as in
yeah.
not just like hearing, you know, like odd, you know, like frequencies, but maybe even like listening as in like observing them and seeing them, and learning more about, yeah, their behaviors. So yeah, and also like if you look at all the past struggles of oppressed groups fighting for their liberation and their rights, it seems kind of weird for, like, it would be really weird for a bunch of men to like say, no, we want to liberate all women, or a bunch of white people say like we want to liberate all like people of color, and just kind of not really, like, all the emphasis is placed on like the privileged groups who are, you know, who self-identify as allies. But that's not how things happen. Like, obviously women fought for themselves, like people of color fought for themselves, so how do we maybe like integrate animals to, non-human animals, to empower them in this struggle that we're all, you know, working on.
I'm just curious, has there been any like adoption of the expanded age idea by like maybe notable labs who have, like, can you provide examples of that maybe?
I'm not sure, I wouldn't say notable labs, but through conferences, yeah, like some labs from, and these are all just like stories I've heard from people that they've started using the bigger cages for like training animals. But see, that's really messed up. Like, you already see how this entire project is being hijacked by an industry that is set out to exploit these animals and use them for whatever. So yeah, like I think one university in Western Canada somewhere has started using those big cages to house rats that are just for training purposes. So for students who want to like practice handling the rats, those rats, because they're not being used for serious types of research, they're housed in there. Yeah.
To revisit the question we were talking about just a minute ago about the savior complex, I don't fully understand the concept. Like, I definitely think saying, you know, we speak for the voiceless, I think that's messed up. That's a very, very problematic and damaging thing to say. It's just like they do have a voice, we just don't listen to it. But I think in a lot of cases, like, it is sort of like when people go in like to a slaughterhouse and like liberate the animals and take them to a sanctuary and let them roam free, like that does seem like saving to me. Like, I don't really that does seem like saving to me. So like we can talk about like other like better ways of viewing that is what I'm curious. Like, how can we mentally frame that idea in a better way possibly? And then my other question would be like, how can we shift the focus away? Like, in what ways does the animal rights movement put the focus on the humans and like, oh, look at us, like it's all about us, you know, veganism is all about us, versus like focusing on the animals and making, you know, this is what I'm doing, but it's about them. So like the two questions were, how can we make it, or I guess three questions, how does the animal rights movement make it about us, because I know we do that, how can we make it more about the animals, and like what what ways is the like savior complex problematic even, even in cases
So yeah, I want to point out that like I have nothing against like actually rescuing animals. I actually think that kind of work is super important, right? That's what I describe as one form of external solidarity, is to actually save individual animals, rescue them so that they can live better lives and like, you know, live out their lives, do the things they actually enjoy. But savior complex is problematic because it is actually a social, like institutional problem. So what the problem with something like savior complex is that it becomes, how would I describe this? Like if you look at all the animal advocacy organizations, you look at how many are out there and how much like money they're getting. Like that is kind of like a problematic outcome with something like the savior complex, where you have all these big like humane societies and like PETA, where people are building their careers on the idea that we have to save these animals. So then that like develops into this like, and I guess you could call it like an NGO industrial complex or something like that, or like a non-profit industrial complex where these advocacy organizations are, so like in the long run that's probably not effective as long as societies keep seeing animals as victims that always need to be rescued and helped, and you always need these organizations of humans to come in and assist them. So I think that's the difference, whereas if you're actually actively trying to empower these animals to get more humans to respect them, it would be different. So that is why maybe people want to critique PETA for always using graphic imagery and violent imagery, where they show animals as as powerless, as always being vulnerable and always being harmed. And so I guess that's what I'll say about the savior complex. What was the second question? Was that just like the...
what do we do that, you sort of touched on it, it was, how do we pull focus to ourselves, and how can we more, how can we put the focus on the animals, like when we, like, because like you were saying, like we focus on like how many numbers of people will come out to a protest. It's, I mean, we're not in the stages where we can count how many animals we save, like, so how can we not, like that seemed, like finding like how many people came out to support us kind of seems like a reasonable thing to do.
I don't know, I think like creating space is not just like something I came up with. Like this is something that a lot of activists talk about in different movements. It's like, say you want to create space for like, I guess, marginalized minorities to have a space where they can speak out, where their voices can be heard. And I think maybe that is one useful way to think about how we might want to interact with animals, is by showing people, like creating a situation in which their voices can be heard. I'm not exactly sure how to go about it. Like I think the Stories of the Liberation action that DXE did was like one really good way to do that, where you're telling the stories of these animals and you're really taking the attention off of the humans who are telling these stories, but trying to get people to like actually understand the meaning of these stories, where the animals are agents and they're kind of participating in their own liberation, and that they're, you know, actively escaping or, you know, fighting off people who are trying to hurt them. So maybe that's a way to do it. And yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe there are other ways, if anybody want to chime in.
Oh, I have a separate question.
Oh, okay.
So if you want to continue this thread, I can ask the question.
Yeah. I don't know. Maybe we'll move on to the other question. I'm not sure. Like,
I was just going to say, I mean, I think a lot of it is just a question of framing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's like so much in discourse, the exact same set of facts can be perceived very differently if you focus on one agent or another. And, you know, like we talk a lot in DXC about the difference between veganism and animal liberation. In many sense, they're reflections of the same thing. There's an equivalency between the two. Veganism is kind of the practice of animal liberation, but the focus of veganism is on the individual human being instead of the animal victim who's on the other side of the supply chain. Right? So that's one example. But speaking of the savior complex, I mean, I think I've had a lot of experiences with this, and I have one particularly vivid and specific story about the practical and very problematic implications of the savior complex. So I know quite a few people have been undercover investigators, and almost every single person I know who's been an undercover investigator at points in their career or in their job have felt incredibly pressured to encourage their coworkers to abuse animals. Because the video footage they're getting and the quality of the video footage they're getting depends on having incredibly egregious, horrendous things happen to animals. And so if you keep getting kind of the routine brutalization of animals, it's just from confinement and normal slaughter, there's no shrieking, there's no flailing around, then you know, look at the footage, they send it to their higher ups and they say, oh, there's nothing going on here, that's not interesting. And so, you know, and that's because the framing of some of the footage, so much of the footage that we use in the framing of our activism is on the savior. What we're trying to get is like this horrible violence that the undercover investigator in this animal rights group is going to come and fix. You know, if you look at it from the animal's perspective, it's like, oh, you know, like that's totally messed up, obviously. I mean, it's horrendously wrong that we could possibly be encouraging more and more grotesque violence against animals. And if you start looking at it from that individual animal's perspective and from the individual animal's perspective in any of these places of violence, then the sorts of stories you tell don't depend on some grotesque, horrible, violent act that some human being can rush in and say. I mean, it's stories like, I mean, not to toot our own horn, but the most recent video we had, we specifically chose that footage because we felt that footage was not footage that objectified and commodified and kind of depersonified the animals, but empowered them in a way and showed, like, I mean, even that image of the cow struggling and trying to move out of the chute. I mean, that to me was a really powerful example of activism that shows the agency of animals, as Ronnie was talking about. And while obviously doesn't empower them in a physical sense, because that individual unfortunately did die, does empower them metaphorically in the sense that we all see this and we can see she's struggling. We want her to win. We want her to get out. So a lot of times it's the same imagery. It's just selectively picking out the salient features that focus on the agency of the animal, that focus on the animal instead of just the human being. And I mean, I think there are a lot of powerful effectiveness reasons we need to do that, even aside from moral concerns about, you know, denigrating the animal's voices.
I just wanted to clarify, because I think it's not exactly clear. Earlier you were talking about why the savior complex is bad, and I think what you said, and I just want to understand exactly the reasons you spelled out, aside from like specific you know, practices within these programs, on a more societal level, why you think the savior complex is bad, I think, is that there are philosophical and institutional consequences. The philosophical is you're promoting this idea in society that animals are like these victims, they don't have a voice, yada yada, and that we as humans have to, you know, be their beneficial saviors, right? And in the long run, that depersonalizes the animals and just kind of perpetuates their slaughter.
Yeah. Or I would say it perpetuates their disempowerment. So it's always seeing them as like being powerless and helpless. Yeah. Yeah.
So the second thing that I want to clarify is you also said, I think, and I want to be sure that I'm actually like, you know, ingraining in my head what you said, that it's institutional as well. That you know, when you have these NGOs and you have these for-profit operations that interact with each other, sometimes they have some like kind of mutualistic relationship whereby you know, the NGO says, oh my god, this is terrible, perhaps they release some kind of footage, create some public outcry, the for-profit institution changes their practices in a way that doesn't necessarily help animals or helps animals in a marginal way. They get a benefit, the NGO gets a benefit of, you know, creating change, and that just cycles. And meanwhile, the animals are all dying.
So like a good example of this would be thinking about like animals in captivity, right? Like there's that heavy discourse on conservation, and that's like we always have to save these species. For some reason, there's always a potential for them to become endangered, and humans don't think about like why we might be responsible for like for them going extinct, but we always have to capture them, put them in these aquariums or zoos to study them so we can better help their species in conservation. And meanwhile, all these humans are making tons of money. So that's kind of an example of how savior complex and other sort of industrial complexes are like kind of all functioning together, and it leads to just an overall disempowerment of the animals who are actually supposed to be like our focus. Yeah.
So, would you say this is like relatively analogous to, so like, men need to stop abusing women. We don't need to tell women to not dress a certain way. We just need to tell men to respect women. And so like, humans need to respect animals, and we don't need to like save them from nature. We need to like just stop fucking them up.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. I think basically it's about shifting back the responsibility to the people who are actually causing the problems, versus saying like, oh, the problem's been caused and they're suffering and therefore we have to like go and help them all the time. Yeah, I think that's part of it, at least anyway. And yeah, I think using I guess like an anti-patriarchy sort of perspective, it is about educating men to be, better human beings and, stop putting, all the responsibility for making the world a better place for women on women, right? So like teaching every time you see a case of an instance of sexism, like as men, we have the responsibility to call that out instead of just, letting it slide. Yeah, so
I just have a question. I was a little confused about that part, the euthanasia room. I was wondering, the two researchers, Joanne and what else?
Joyce.
And
Joanna and Joyce.
Joanne and Joyce, did they have to do that at some point?
Um,
And what were their thoughts, and like what was the at which point were some of the...
So Joyce didn't have to do that because, like I said, because she socialized all her rats. All of her rats were adopted out. And
Hold that thought.
but the interesting thing with that situation was that like UBC didn't have an adoption program, so she actually had to get an adoption form from a different university in the US, which I don't remember which one, and then she changed like the heading and everything, and then it had to be approved directly by like the head of the animal care services person at UBC or something like that. So it's this it's this weird thing, like it's a very uncommon rare thing that actually happens. Yeah, like my understanding is I wasn't there to see it happen because I got fired from my job, but Joanna actually, yeah, she did have to euthanize all of her rats.
Did she do it herself?
I think so, yeah, and because like I had email exchanges, like just briefly few email exchanges with her during the time where I got fired from my job because of my animal activism, and that was when almost exactly when the project ended anyway. And she told me like she didn't want to deal with like the situation of me getting fired from the lab because she had a lot other emotional issues to deal with at the time, which I totally understood. Yeah, so I think she took that responsibility and then she euthanized all her rats. And then from what I knew is like after that she went back home on sort of a lengthy vacation, which I totally understand, like what, you need to be away from all that awful stuff once, all the rats that you've been working with. And this is like someone who's inside the labs genuinely like working with these animals out of care. Like she honestly wants the experimentation on rats to end, and that's like the purpose of why she's doing that work. Obviously from like an effectiveness point of view, we as animal liberation activists might say like, why are you doing that? But at the same time, like I really appreciate the work that she's doing, because so many rats are, that's the site of their struggle, is in the laboratory, and she's in there as an ally to these animals and like actually assisting them and speaking out for them. Yeah, so I don't know. I guess that's it. What else I'll say?
Like, I think that's interesting because it's obviously like seeing the rats in the enriched cages. I've lived with rats and I'm pretty familiar with, these individuals at least, and I can extrapolate to their behaviors, but like there's obviously a noticeable difference in terms of happiness and, you know, exhibiting their natural behaviors. But the problem I guess I see, and I wonder if you could speak about it a little more, is just like this research that goes into talking about how to enrich the lives of rats. Is that only going to be used to kind of, if it makes better research, if they become more effective models, you know, because they are not in as intense confinement, like is that only going to prolong the exploitation of rats? And it's like, so it's like a balance of, yes, you're, I guess, helping these individuals in a sense, but are you just kind of extending this idea and this industry of exploitation? And so.
Yeah, I had to answer a similar question, and I think one thing to keep in mind is that this is highly controversial within the laboratory industry of like people doing scientific research. A lot of scientists actually think that everything this is about this is just complete crap. Like the idea of giving animals a bigger, like less controllable living environment is just like nonsense, because it ruins your data and results, or it has the potential to do that. And scientists tend to want a situation where everything is very consistent and everything is like easy to control, right? It's all about control. It's like a big part of science. So the moment you tell them like, hey, what about giving, you know, rats better room, like more like space, more room to roam around, like there's a lot of resistance against that. Even though some scientists have argued that if animals are happier and are more normal, then actually whatever research happens would produce better results. So from a practical standpoint, I don't even think something like that is will be adopted, which is why I kind of disagree with where Joyce and Joanna are, the direction they've taken their research, which is why I'm trying to like reframe the research and bring it out of like the laboratory context to say like, hey, your work actually has a lot of political implication that is useful for activism. And what was the other? Yeah, so definitely, like, even if it does work, I think it could sustain the industry for sure. If it happens that it does produce better results, and more scientists begin to get on board with it, and the public perception of it changes, where people are seeing these rats in bigger cages and they appear to be happier, and they become more like tolerant of animal experimentation. All those factors could potentially happen, and then just, you know, like delay animal liberation. Yeah.
I guess that kind of reminds me of like the gestation crate deal, where people, you know, a lot of people, it's like a kind of, it's like it's gonna prolong it. You know, the general public, when they see that they're, oh, bigger crates, okay, well then it's gonna be fine to still eat them. But I wanted to ask you, so I'm not really sure, but this seems like it would only work on like certain, like, you know, certain science experiments. I'm sure there's other experiments where the rats are kind of used to be disposable. So obviously this seems like are you trying to talk to people, like scientists that are doing certain experiments, like more like trying to find out like about animal cognition, like those scientists, rather than obviously people like doing cosmetic testing or whatever, like chemical testing and stuff? Or you guys are just trying to get this out there?
Well, I'm not involved in any of those conversations
okay.
that actually happen, but I think for people like Joyce and Joanna, and I guess now just Joanna, because like Joyce went on to do other stuff. She's no longer involved with like animal research at all. She's actually now a practicing Buddhist, and which is very interesting. Like she believes that's like a much better thing to do to, you know, promote compassion towards all beings in life. But I'd say Joanna and her supervisor, they're still trying to have those conversations with the scientists and trying to convince them to, because they're, I wouldn't speak about Joanna, but like I think her supervisor is a welfarist, very much a welfarist, and thinks that animal use is okay as long as like we make the animals happy. And but even then, like I would say he's actually much more critical in some cases, which he thinks like eventually it has to be phased out or something like that as better technology is developed, or like ethics approval for research needs to be more strict. Like some research that are just like unwarranted, like we don't need to do that kind of research, should just be thrown out. Like we don't need to do. It's not important for society. It's not important. It doesn't contribute to like greater knowledge about anything. But yeah, so I think they are trying to convince more people to adopt these practices.
And I'm sure it makes it harder since like lab rats, they're not under the law, they have, there's no protection for them, so I'm sure the scientists on top of, already viewing them as disposable, when they look at the law, no one cares about them, so it's even a harder fight, I think.
Yeah, and yeah, I have very mixed feelings about the impact of their work, because like I went to one of their presentations that was meant for lab workers and lab technicians, and after the people saw the videos, like at the end of the talk, they came up and one of them was asking about like, she seemed really concerned. She was like, what can I do to make to implement some of these practices? Like, how can I give them toys to play with? Like, like you can see they begin to feel really concerned and like feel bad, but because their mindset is still that we have to use these animals and they will be used anyway, and it's part of their job, right, to take care of these animals, and that's the limitation where they can't do anything beyond that because it's constrained by society.
So as someone, I've actually worked in some animal testing facilities too. My dad was an animal researcher at a big pharmaceutical company, and most, especially big institutions that are testing on rodents, won't have like 6 rodents they're experimenting on. It's thousands and thousands and thousands of them, lining in cages and cages and cages. So just the numerical scale of testing on rodents, especially in the United States, I mean, the figures I've seen for the United States and for mice and rats and rodents as a whole are, we have no good statistics, but it's in the tens of millions at least. So, and sometimes at one institution at UCSF, there are a total of 1 million individual animals at UCSF and probably maybe 100,000, or at least tens of thousands of rodents. So just the scale makes it impossible for them to implement this sort of system. So one thing I want to, just reaffirm for this space is that Darren and all of us are absolutely coming from an animal liberation perspective, and even terms like euthanasia, which is the common term that vivisectors and animal researchers like to use. I mean, it's a reframing of that practice. It's not just euthanasia; it's killing. And I think, and the question Darren is asking with this presentation, you should correct me if I'm wrong, is how do we interact with that institution and with people within that institution who do seem to be genuinely interested in creating some sort of long-term institutional change? How do we interact with those institutions in a way that can lead to constructive progress for us and them alike, and ultimately for the animals, most importantly? So I think that's the question, and it's a hard one. I mean, DXE is struggling with this question all the time too, because the campaigns we're run headfirst into what most of the people in the animal rights are doing, and there's inevitably going to be clash there. And the question is, well, how do we interface with them in a way that will hopefully allow progress of the animals, that won't cause unnecessary infighting? But sometimes you do have to get into fights, and I'm sure there are times where you've had a lot of tension with some of your colleagues, and obviously since Darren got fired, there was some obvious tension there because they decided he was no longer welcome there. I had a question too, and that is, I thought this great presentation, fantastic, honestly probably the best presentation I've ever seen about animal experimentation, just in the depth and the particularities, the detail too. So the depth of the analysis, the theory, and then also the particularities. Like I love the videos of the rats and how that was integrated into your presentation. One of the most fascinating things about this presentation and the advocacy that these two researchers are doing, and that you were sort of trying to do too, is that you're focusing on rats, right? And you say this at the beginning, that rats are perceived as vermin, people hate them, and Ratatouille changes a little bit, but still the general perception of the public at large is that rodents are vermin. And the traditional animal rights model has always been to focus on the low-hanging fruit and the animals that we think that already appeal to people, dogs and cats and primates. And this is the approach that Stephen Wise has taken at the Great Ape Project and the Non-Human Rights Project. Right? They're going to focus on these charismatic, so-called intelligent species and try to incrementally change society that way. I actually think this model of activism, the storytelling, you offered today is probably more important and more effective, because it's precisely because you're focusing on this species that historically has been so denigrated, and so the shock value. I mean, just even talking about rats as individuals and seeing them as agents of play and fun and agents that deserve that sort of meaning in life is so dramatically jarring for people outside of the animal rights movement, even some people within the animal rights movement. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that, and why you specifically decided to write this paper and do this presentation on rats, and how you see rats fitting into the broader movement, not just against animal testing, but for animal liberation as, you know, the prototypical anti-charismatic species.
Yeah.
The example I was thinking of was chickens too, in the context of broader animal liberation advocacy. I mean, chickens again are one of the most routinely abused animals in farm animal production, and there's a tendency not to focus as much on them because they're not as charismatic or stupid or whatever the prejudice is that we have against chickens.
Yeah.
It seems like you have the same dynamic of rats in the context of animal experimentation.
Yeah. Well, first of all, like, thank you for that super eloquent, like, representation of my presentation.
It's really fucking great.
I didn't even think of it that way, but now that you've like brought out that framework of thinking about what I was talking about here, yeah, I think maybe this is kind of impactful because like Kelly and I have talked about this too, how like speciesism exists within the animal rights movement. Like you described that people tend to go for animals that like humans already are more sympathetic towards. So maybe this is a way to, yeah, like bring attention to not just the general public, but activists within the animal rights and animal liberation movement to get them to see the possibility of advocating for a species that are just so commonly seen as like, no, they have no chance. Like, let's focus on other animals first. And maybe even like, yeah, like animals that animal liberation or animal rights activists sometimes might even, you know, like secretly, you know, perform violence against, you know, it's like if they get into their house and like are just out of control or something like that. Who knows, it's a possibility, but
There's a big struggle at the vegan house in San Jose, which one of our co-organizers is a resident of the house as to whether they should use mouse traps and poison. And one of the residents, a vegan, you know, or a so-called vegan, wanted to do it because they thought, oh, you know, they're infiltrating our quote-unquote our space.
yeah. But I also think, what do I want to say? Like this kind of stuff has, one thing I forgot to point out is that when Joyce and Joanna decided to do a project like this, like even in the beginning there was already reciprocity being created between some people who are outside of the labs with the animals who are inside the labs. So by that I mean what they've done is they've taken practices and knowledge from outside of the labs that a lot of people are already familiar with and understand, and they bring it into the laboratory to show other people like a different type of relationships you can have with these animals. So a lot of the things they've done is common practice with people who have rats as companion animals, or things that people do in rescue shelters for small animals by using like fleas and hammocks and things like that. So that's the kind of thing that has potential to, I guess, maybe build coalitions with people who we might not necessarily consider as animal liberation activists, but really care about specific species of animals. So, like for example, in Vancouver we have an organization called Small Animal Rescue Society, and all they deal with are small mammals like rodents, you know, guinea pigs, rats, mice, a lot of rabbits. Rabbits aren't rodents, but they deal with a lot of rabbits. So they're like individuals working, trying to help these animals, but they might not even be part of like the greater animal liberation movement. Maybe a lot of them aren't even vegans, but they just like, they have these like deep connections with these small animals. So something like this, I don't know, maybe it can like start conversations with people who are concerned about small animals. So you know what I'm trying to say. I can't articulate it really well right now, but just yeah, like through something like this, a presentation like this maybe to reframe practices are already common for a lot of people who run shelters and care about these animals, to maybe join the animal liberation movement and be like, hey, you can fight for rats who are being exploited in the laboratory. Yeah.
Oh, I was just gonna say that I think it's important for, you know, stuff like this to be discussed, you know, within the animal rights community, and for us to even, you know, advocate for lab rats, because, you know, I've gotten a lot of, you know, jeering questions like, oh, well, what about this animal? Or what, you know, the lesser, cuter ones. And so I think if it's put out there, then people are gonna see, okay, well, they take this seriously. It's not just, you know, this one animal. These people are serious, all animals. You know, I feel like, you know, let's put our words where our mouth, or, you know, or whatever that saying is, sorry. It's escaped me, but you know what I mean. Yeah, so I think it's important to, you know, for this type of stuff to be out there, for us to be talking about it.
And it seems like you have a lot of success, even among the oppressor class. I mean, the people who are specifically oppressing these animals. It seems like they've had a lot of success in convincing some of these researchers.
Yeah, that's hard to say because there's not no data around that.
Sure.
Like, but yeah, just you know, through anecdotes and stories that
Sure.
people tell, it seems like it has an impact on people. Like how long that will actually last, you know.
Of course.
And so,
Impact meaning they're choosing not to use rats at all, or they're
or
caring.
no, like instances when people saw rats burrowing, like the video of rats burrowing, and they like just gasped. They're like, whoa, that's like amazing. Because when when the only times you ever see rats, they're always just like not moving around. It's really easy to kind of perceive them as just these animals who sit around all day and do nothing, and almost just like objects, like they're not moving. So it's okay to do all sorts of things to them, versus seeing them in an environment where they are playing with each other and running around and climbing. And yeah, it's very different, and that kind of impact on people. And also, yeah, just apparently, like, humans who work with animals are happier if the animals are happier, which is like seems like common sense to me. But that's also something that people want to push, like within the industry, is to promote, like, hey, you can have a happy relationship with these animals. And so a lot of people might be like depressed. There's like counseling services for lab workers, for example, and so that's something that might lab workers might find attractive, like as to make it more impactful or something like that. I don't know if that made any sense, but I don't know, any other comments? Sure.
You gotta choose me, I'm not just so I just wanted to bring it back to a comment you made about potentially bringing...
I thought this was supposed to be informal, and it was like intense questions coming.
Alright, I'll just say it differently.
Yeah.
So earlier you talked about, so you mentioned, I don't know, I'm trying to use some lesser language. So you mentioned bringing, because you mentioned at first you wanted to talk, how do we and take this kind of from the academic world and bring it into activism, and that's what we want this conversation to be about. And so you mentioned possibly using, I guess I would say using animals at demos as kind of like representative species to kind of make this idea concrete. It's not just a bunch of animals stuck in some lab that we can't see, but these are actual individuals. See, here is this individual. And I know that my experience with rats and living with rats is obviously why I feel so strongly for them, is because I feel like I really know rats. I talk to Priya about this all the time. But so I think that kind of experience with these other animals is important, in a way and trying to understand them and their perspectives and to even care for them. But it's like, how do we do that in like a non-exploitative way? Because at the same time, it's like, I mean, I guess you would have to know the individual rat if you were going to bring them to a demo or something, and to determine if they're comfortable being out in an open area like that around people chanting and things or whatever. So it's like, I just wondering what you were thinking when you mentioned that.
Yeah, it was just purely just kind of a suggestion that's something that's possible, but I would almost like advise against it because I've heard a lot of times when people would bring dogs to demos and it's actually not good for them because the situation environment is so intense, like it's not just, it's not a good situation, and they get freaked out. So can animals like, maybe we can think about like, so the part where I mentioned, it's not on there anymore, but coming up with more creative ways to include animals in a demo. So maybe have animals present, but make it like a silent vigil would be like to create a situation where their voices can be heard while they're present, but it's also not a situation that could scare them or harm them or something like that. That's one possibility, because like I know a lot of people, what was the National Animal Rights Day kind of demonstrations is like dead animals, and that is really powerful as well, but it's kind of conveying a different message if you have live animals there where people can actually see them being alive and enjoying life maybe. And so I thought like, I just kind of suggested that like rats are small and we can kind of like carry them around, they'll sit on our shoulders, we can put them inside pockets. And to avoid exploitation is like, I don't know, I guess that again comes down to the framing, right? If they're participating in a demo that is like meant for them, I can't see that as exploiting them. We're actually giving them a chance to like stand up for themselves, and allowing people to see like, what if we did bring like Esther the pig, who is apparently very well socialized, and is basically behaving like a dog. What if we brought a dog and an Esther to a demonstration that is quiet, peaceful, with a lot of messages talking about like, hey, these animals are all the same, stop exploiting them, and then people can see that these are two animals both alive right in front of me, and they can suffer just the same. I guess say that.
And for people who are concerned about, for like a lot of the reasons you said that may be harmful to the animals, for bringing non-human animals to demonstrations, I've often seen, I think many of us have seen, people bring body screens or different types of monitors to show footage of animal abuse. I mean, we could also bring footage of animals, like at a sanctuary or in the wild, or even there is footage of like animals chasing after their children, or trying to protect their children from humans or other things. So maybe we could have like video, a body screen of like animals in a positive light, empowering themselves.
Yeah.
Something like that, instead of the disempowered animal.
Yeah, and that's something I've been thinking about quite a bit, like just when I started thinking about issues like this, is I tend to always try to go for a balance. Like I'm not completely against graphic imagery, which I know like some people are just completely against using it, but I don't think the imagery necessarily has to be graphic, but it does we have to show people the reality of things as well. But that has to be balanced with like a possibility that people can see, so they're not just walking away seeing these animals. It's like that's all they'll ever be. Like, so yeah, I totally agree with that. Just having videos of both like animals in confinement and being abused, but then also show them animals in farm sanctuaries and roaming around and being happy, and there's something else I wanted to say, but I can't remember.
I thought you were raising your foot. I got a question.
Okay. So, any more
Awesome. Good. Cool. Thank you.